He was born on August 15th, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica, on an island that had only just become French the year before. He entered military school at age 9, became an artillery officer at 16, and at 24 was promoted to brigadier general after helping crush a royalist uprising in Paris in 1795. At 26, he took command of the army of Italy and destroyed a string of larger Austrian and Piedmontese forces in 1796 and 1797 with speed, deception, and a brutality that made Europe rearrange itself around his name. At 35, he crowned himself Emperor of the French in Notre Dame Cathedral on December 2nd, 1804, before a crowd that watched as one man turned revolution into empire. And by June 18th, 1815, after 100 days of restored power, he was broken at Waterloo, sent into exile, and eventually left to die alone on St. Helena on May 5th, 1821. This is the story of how a boy from Corsica remade the map of Europe and then watched the same world swallow him whole. Napoleon Bonaparte was born into a world that was already changing around him. Corsica had become French only 1 year earlier, in 1768, after centuries of shifting rule, and Napoleon entered life as a subject of a new empire before he ever had a chance to define himself. His family was minor Corsican nobility, not rich enough to be secure and not poor enough to be invisible. His father, Carlo Buonaparte, worked the family into French patronage so his sons could receive education in mainland France. That decision would save Napoleon and alienate him at the same time. At age 9, he was sent to the military school at Brienne. There, in a monastery-like school with severe discipline, harsh winters, and boys from richer families who looked down on his Corsican accent, he learned what it meant to be isolated. He was small, serious, and intensely proud. He read constantly, especially history and military campaigns, and by the time he left Brienne in 1784, he had built a mind that treated war like a problem to be solved, rather than a spectacle to be admired. From Brienne, he moved to the École Militaire in Paris, where he completed the program in 1 year instead of 3, and graduated in October 1785 as a second lieutenant in the artillery. Artillery mattered because artillery rewarded calculation. It was not a branch for aristocratic bravado. It was for men who could measure distance, angle, timing, and consequence. Napoleon chose the right weapon for the kind of mind he had. He was assigned to the La Fère Artillery Regiment and spent the next years learning the craft of movement, supply, and force. At the same time, his private life was marked by family strain. His father died in February 1785, leaving the Bonapartes in financially difficult circumstances, and Napoleon, still a teenager, felt the burden of being the one who had to rise. The French Revolution gave him the opening he had been waiting for. In 1789, France did not simply change government. It cracked open the social order that had defined Europe for centuries. Napoleon was not yet the man history would remember, but he had already understood something important. Revolutions do not reward loyalty to the past. They reward speed, nerve, and the ability to see the new center of power before everyone else does. At first, he leaned toward Corsican nationalism, but as the island's politics turned against the French revolutionary state, he chose France instead. That decision severed him from his Corsican roots and tied his future to the fate of the Republic. His first major chance came in 1793 at Toulon. The port city had rebelled against the Republic and allowed British and Spanish forces into the harbor, turning a strategic French naval base into an enemy foothold. The Republican siege was failing when a 24-year-old artillery officer proposed a new plan. He was ignored at first, then listened to, then vindicated. Napoleon's gun placements helped drive the enemy from the harbor and restore the city to French control. The result was immediate. He was promoted to brigadier general at age 24. That promotion was not just a career step. It was the moment France learned his name. In March 1796, Napoleon was given command of the Army of Italy, and the French government expected a competent campaign, not a transformation in European history. What they got was a series of victories so fast, so aggressive, and so strategically precise that by the end of that year he had already become the most dangerous man in France. He crossed the Alps with an exhausted army, split his enemies apart, and beat Austrian and Piedmontese forces that outnumbered him and expected him to collapse. Instead, he drove them back battle after battle, taking Milan in May 1796, forcing the surrender of Piedmont, and stunning a continent that had not yet learned how quickly he could move. The Italian campaign made him famous because it made him look inevitable. At Lodi, at Castiglione, at Arcole, and finally at Rivoli in January 1797, he repeatedly used speed, concentration, and deception to destroy larger armies before they could coordinate. By October 17, 1797, Austria signed the Treaty of Campo Formio, ceding major territory and accepting French dominance across northern Italy. Napoleon had not merely won a war. He had taught Europe that a new kind of commander had arrived, one who could turn the battlefield into a political instrument. France sent him into Italy as a general. It returned him as a legend. But legends do not stay in the field forever. By 1799, the Directory in Paris was weak, discredited, and exhausted by war, inflation, corruption, and internal collapse. Napoleon returned from Egypt and saw the opening immediately. On November 9th and 10th, 1799, in the coup of �བྷᴜ𝐵ᴜ, he used soldiers, political allies, and sheer personal momentum to dissolve the old regime and replace it with the consulate. France now had 3 consuls, but only one mattered. Napoleon became first consul, and the revolution that had destroyed a king now had a man standing where the king had been. What followed was 5 years of tightening control. He stabilized state finances, reorganized administration, and made his authority look like order rather than conquest. In 1802, he became first consul for life. In 1804, after a plebiscite that formalized what everyone already knew, he declared France an empire and himself its hereditary emperor. On December 2nd, 1804, in Notre Dame Cathedral, he took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. It was one of the most symbolic acts of the age. He was telling Europe that no church, no dynasty, and no tradition would give him power. He would seize it, legitimize it, and display it in public. For a few years, the system worked. Napoleon crushed the Austrians and Russians at Austerlitz in 1805. He smashed Prussia at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. He forced Russia into temporary accommodation at Friedland in 1807. By 1810, he controlled most of continental Europe through direct rule, allied monarchs, or client states. But the empire was built on perpetual motion, and perpetual motion eventually outruns itself. Spain became a bleeding wound in 1808. The Peninsular War turned into a long, ugly war of attrition that drained French manpower and money, while the British under Wellington kept the pressure on. Then came 1812. Napoleon invaded Russia with a grand army of roughly 600,000 men. It was the biggest gamble of his life and one of the biggest military disasters in modern history. The Russians refused to give him the decisive battle he wanted, burned their own capital behind them, and turned distance itself into a weapon. By the time Napoleon retreated from Moscow, winter, hunger, disease, and Russian harassment had gutted his army. What had marched east like an imperial machine came back as a broken stream of survivors. Europe saw the truth in that retreat. He was not invincible. In 1813, the coalition closed in. In 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. He escaped less than a year later, returned in March 1815, and seized power again in the 100 Days. That return lasted 100 days, and it ended at Waterloo on June 18, 1815, where Wellington and Blücher destroyed his final army. Napoleon fled again, this time to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, where no army could rescue him and no rumor could restore him. He died there on May 5, 1821, at age 51, after 6 years of exile, having spent his final chapter writing himself into history from a prison of rock and ocean. Napoleon had remade Europe, but he had also revealed the cost of a world organized around one man's will. He built laws, broke states, crowned himself, and conquered half a continent. He also left behind a battlefield full of kingdoms, widows, and graves. That is the contradiction at the heart of his story. He was the man who made modern Europe, and the man who proved how quickly greatness can become ruin when it believes it no longer needs restraint. On St. Helena, Napoleon was stripped of everything except memory. The island was remote, windy, and impossible to escape in any practical sense. Britain had chosen it precisely because no emperor, no matter how brilliant, could turn it into a stage for return. Napoleon spent nearly 6 years there under guard, dictating memoirs, arguing with his captors, and carefully shaping how the world would remember him. Even in exile, he understood that history was another battlefield, and he refused to surrender it. He died on May 5, 1821, at age 51. The official autopsy listed stomach cancer as the cause of death, though later debate over arsenic and poisoning would keep the mystery alive for centuries. He was buried on the island before his remains were later returned to France, where he was transformed from defeated ruler into national myth. That transformation says almost as much about Europe as it does about him. The continent that had fought him for 20 years could not finally decide whether he was its greatest threat or its greatest modernizer. Because Napoleon did not only leave behind battlefields, he left behind institutions. The Napoleonic Code, first implemented in 1804, helped unify French civil law and spread across much of Europe, while also influencing legal systems far beyond it, from Latin America to Louisiana. It abolished feudal privilege, standardized law, and strengthened the authority of the state. It also limited women's rights and restored hierarchy in the home. That was Napoleon in one sentence. He broke one old order and rebuilt another around control, efficiency, and his own authority. His legacy remains impossible to simplify. He was a reformer and a conqueror, a builder and a destroyer, a man who gave Europe modern administration while drowning it in war. He showed how a single individual, armed with talent, timing, and absolute confidence, could bend history in ways that outlived his own empire. But he also proved that greatness without restraint eventually consumes itself. Napoleon remade Europe. Then Europe buried him. And even in death, he never completely stopped fighting to be remembered on his own terms.